Welcome to Park Media. I'm your host today, Vince Emanuele, and we are joined by Bridget Meehan. Bridget is based in Ireland, and she is a community activist and public policy researcher. She is the co-founder of Our Money, the campaign for a mutual bank in the north of Ireland, and the co-founder of Collaboration for Change, a network of progressive activists across Ireland. Welcome to the program, Bridget.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's good to have you here. Why don't you give us a little background about where exactly? So there's a lot of people who will be listening to this who live in the United States and might not know exactly where you're located, or of course the history of that area. I think most Americans probably know that the British colonized Ireland, but I don't think that many who will be listening to this might know beyond that. So just give folks a sense of your personal background, where you're located, and a little history of where you're at, if you could, please.
Okay. I suppose, first of all, I've been involved in left activism for about 20 years, just to kind of start with that. And I'm involved in that activism because it feels better to be doing something rather than just standing back and looking at all the injustices in the world and doing nothing about them. And it's not that my activism is anything spectacular. That's not the point. The point is, to get involved in whatever way I can, because I believe the more of us who are involved in activism, the more chance we have of making change. And I think everybody can make a contribution, and every contribution is important. So that's kind of just explaining very briefly why I'm bothering with activism. I grew up in a part of Ireland called County Donegal. So there's 32 counties in the country. It's a really small place. If people know it on the map, it's a speck. But we have 32 counties, and they're just sort of smaller jurisdictions that the place is divided into. And Donegal is the most northerly county. It's on the border with the north of Ireland, or people might know it as Northern Ireland, but I don't use that name. And that's where the conflict happened in Ireland, and that conflict and the reasons for that conflict really shaped my worldview from a very early age, and it's certainly a big part of why I'm involved in left activism today. So I can give you a bit of background about the conflict, because you did mention that people might know that Ireland was a colony of the British Empire. So just to maybe talk a bit about some of that history, if you're okay with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So just trying to put the conflict in the north into context. The conflict there was just one conflict in a long line of conflicts that took place in Ireland. So we were colonized by the English about 800 years ago. It goes back a long way. And down the centuries, Irish people were constantly fighting the English, trying to get rid of them. You have some experience of that in America. That was what your War of Independence was about. But we struggled to get rid of them in one go. So it's that kind of rebellions have been going on for centuries. Their rule here, much like their rule anywhere in any country that they colonized, was brutally oppressive. And they crushed the native people here. It displaced us as landowners. They planted a ruling class who appropriated all the land that was worth anything anyway. And they basically enslaved the native population. And they did everything they could to wipe out Irish culture. So, for example, my first language is English. I can't speak Irish, and that's I suppose an outcome of colonization. The cruelty and the violence of the English against the Irish people was constant and extreme all down those centuries, and a lot of the time they used Ireland as sort of their guinea pigs or their lab if they wanted to experiment with new techniques and oppression. And if they worked here, then they took them off to the rest of their colonies. So we were sort of that kind of, we were used as that in that way by them as well. They just saw us as savages. and in my opinion, they were the savages with their sort of merciless treatment of Irish people and people that they colonized everywhere. Um, so that is kind of, it's probably sounds very one-sided. I'm obviously Irish speaking about this happening, so it doesn't. I'm not going to be painting it pretty, but I think there's not a lot of positive comments that you can make about being colonized. I think it is what it is. It's pretty negative. At one point here, I mean, this is kind of another example of the kind of thing that they did. There was a famine in the mid 1800s here, and that pretty much wiped out half the population, either between people just dying from starvation or having to immigrate to avoid dying. At that time, thousands of people immigrated to America. And the famine didn't happen because there was a drought or some other catastrophe. It happened because British landlords extracted everything that was produced here, the crops, the livestock, everything, and Irish people were just left with potatoes. That's what we lived on. So there's kind of jokes about Irish people eating potatoes all the time, but there was a time when that was the case. So what happened in the famine was that potato crop failed for a couple of years running, so that the people didn't have anything left to eat, and they starved. And even though they were starving, the British didn't care. They just kept extracting from the country. So that's that's their form, that's their history with us. So I suppose after centuries of trying to, fight them off, centuries of failed rebellions and risings, Ireland eventually made a breakthrough in 1916. And we had what's called the Easter Rising. That's probably more famous than any of the rest of them. Technically, it was another failure, but and when it happened, it didn't have widespread support among the Irish population. But the British executed the leaders of that rebellion, and that kind of changed the attitude. It sort of lit the torch paper for further upheaval. Those executions were seen as particularly heartless, and there was even one of the leaders he was so badly wounded he couldn't actually stand up in front of the firing squad, and he had to be seated. So things like that really got to people, and after a bit of time there was like a war broke out, and that was our War of Independence. It lasted about 2 years, and after that time it ended with an agreement signed between the British and the Irish. Unfortunately, it only achieved partial independence. So as I said earlier, there's 32 counties in Ireland. With this agreement after the War of Independence, only 26 were given independence, and 6 counties, those in the north, were partitioned, and they stayed under British rule. That became officially Northern Ireland, and the independent part became the Republic of Ireland. So that partition of the country caused another war, kind of an outbreak of a civil war, which lasted for a while, and that was between people for partition and people against partition. But that soon ended, and partition won over and was enforced, and there's been partition now since 1921. So a lot of people who might be aware of the conflict in the north, they might think that it's a war about religion, that it's about Protestants and Catholics fighting each other, but that's not actually the case. That's kind of propaganda that the British feed the world because it takes them out of the picture. It makes them look like innocent bystanders. But that conflict was about imperialism and oppression, very much so. And it was between the British and Irish Republicans. Irish Republicans, not to be confused with the Republican Party in the US. The Republicans here are people who want to reunite Ireland as a 32-county republic. The The IRA, which is the Irish Republican Army, was the guerrilla army who fought the British during the Northern Conflict, and they weren't fighting with the Protestant population who lived in Ireland. That's a fact. Although the Protestant population did get involved because they were originally people who were planted here from England and Scotland as part of colonisation, and they still maintained their Britishness, their identity as British, and see themselves still as subjects of the British Crown. So when Irish forces here started to fight the British, they believed that was part of their war too, but it wasn't against them. Definitely not. But then it's easy just to call it a war about religion. That's what these kind of imperialist powers do, to try and blame the natives and keep themselves out of the picture. Protestants were the majority in the north. They still are, only slightly now, but before they had quite a large majority, and they ruled by proxy for the British. And they just discriminated against the Celtic population here. They discriminated so that Catholics were denied or restricted a lot of rights, like voting rights, or fair elections, or access to council housing, access to government jobs. And the police force here was a militia police force that was made up mostly of Protestants. That kind of scenario, that kind of environment, set the scene for a lot of unrest, and that too fed into the conflict. So there's kind of two things there. There's the long-lasting fight against the British in general to get them off our island, and then there's the discrimination and anti-rights situation that then developed in the north. So that's kind of the conflict there. So really, living along the border to that, although I was not on the northern side, but on the southern side of the border, we were close enough to kind of see all of that discrimination, all of that oppression, and see that happening very up close and personal. And then also being aware of Irish history down the centuries and how we had been colonised and oppressed, and that does kind of shape you as a person and your attitudes towards things. So my family, and not everybody would have been like this, but my family certainly was highly politicised. My paternal grandparents were involved in the War of Independence and the Civil War, and they took an anti-partition side because they believed in Ireland being free of the British and not to have partition. So we've always supported the aim of a united Ireland, and we supported the IRA campaign and the conflict as well. Didn't see any problem with that. Although bad things happen, as they do in any conflict, but we supported the IRA's campaign. And growing up only a few miles from the border near Derry City, I live in Derry City now, but Derry City is the birthplace of the civil rights movement in the north. It's the place where Bloody Sunday happened. I don't know if people are familiar with that, but
can you tell
it was
people?
Very much. Yeah, okay, just very briefly. Bloody Sunday was when the civil rights movement was really gaining momentum, and they were having civil rights marches, very similar to what you would see in the US back in the 60s, because it was happening around the same time. The civil rights movement here was modelled on the Black civil rights movement in the US, which gives us a really strong identification with Black people there, supporting their cause there. But we were, the movement here was very much modelled on what was happening there. And Derry was sort of the birthplace of it. We even have Free Derry Corner, which is modelled, I think, on the one in San Francisco. But the Bloody Sunday was basically where on a Sunday in January, the march, there was a march going ahead in the city in Derry, and the British Army, the paratroopers came out, and they were just told to fire at will. So they shot into the crowd. They tried to say that they were being shot at. That's since been proved false. And they shot dead, I think, 14 people. 13 people died that day, and then one died later on in hospital. So that basically ended the civil rights movement, but it did trigger the conflict. I think people at that stage thought, peaceful means aren't really working here, so we'll just up the ante. And there's, division about whether that was the right thing to do, or whether the civil rights movement should have continued. But I suppose when you're in the middle of these things and they happen, it's easy in hindsight to say this or that should have happened, but it's very different when you're there in the middle of it and what the decisions you make. So that really did upset people a lot. But I think, growing up very close to that and seeing that happen, and then a family that is talking about that, aware of that, and very much supporting the Catholics in the North and opposing that injustice and that oppression, that is a lot of where my background, how I get that, and why I sort of get involved in the activism that I do get involved in today. So I would say that, it's given me an appreciation of what it's like to be oppressed and to be on the receiving end of oppression. So it's very easy for me to identify with people that are going through the same thing. I think a lot of Irish people would feel the same way. And, I don't think it's any harm to have that kind of background. I think it does give you a better view, and I think for me anyway, it's meant that I just wouldn't take at face value what a government is saying, what state forces are saying, what the news says. You learn to mistrust all of that kind of stuff, because they're the people that are doing wrong to your community. They're the people that are lying and sending out propaganda. So, that it does impact you in how you think, and you carry a lot of that thinking with you into your adulthood. Obviously, that background does shape my thinking, but it doesn't define my thinking entirely today. So I suppose trying to bring all that into context with where I'm at now and what I do now, or what I've done as an adult. I suppose as I've grown older, I've developed a more nuanced understanding of all of these things and all of the things that happened. When I was younger, I had a narrow view that there were the good guys and the bad guys. All oppressed people were the good guys. All imperialists were the bad guys. It's a very easy black and white sort of picture to have. But I would see that differently now. I'm still opposed to imperialism and oppression. I don't think you can ever paint anything positive about them. But I think people are people, wherever they are, whoever they are. You get people who are cruel and aggressive, or kind and peace-loving in every culture. So I wouldn't see the British people as the problem anymore, the way I would have done maybe when I was younger. The average British person is really contending with the same kind of problems as the average Irish person, or people everywhere. And of course, personally, I'd love to see United Ireland happen, where there's no more British rule here. But if it's a United Ireland that's neoliberal, then as far as I'm concerned, that would be no better than being under British rule. So I've come to see not just the national question in the context of my own country, but the wider political question about how, I suppose, about who is really in power, who is really in control, and how that's not really good for the majority of us, and how really that needs to be the thing that's attacked. I don't think really that nationalism is that healthy. And you can see over and over again across the world how divisive nationalism can be, and some of the extremism that comes from it. But to me, it always comes back to that issue of oppression, whether it's based on class, on capitalism, neoliberalism, if it's gender or race or sexual orientation, whatever form it takes. It's oppression that you need to be against, not each other. And it's about really uniting with other people who are suffering forms of oppression and discrimination, and looking at what we have in common rather than what divides us. So that's really where my energies go into these days. I've talked for too long there.
No, I'm glad. There's a million things I would like to ask you. One of the first things I would like to ask for people who would be interested is, what are the sort of books, films, movies, pieces of literature that you would recommend for people who would like to learn more about this history? Like, what are the things that you would recommend to someone who's asking, like, hey, I want to learn more about this history and there's a ton of bullshit out there, but I want to get like a really good take on it? What would be some of your recommendations?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, because I'm trying to think now offhand who the best sources are. Like, a lot of the film, say you talk about films first of all, you mentioned those there. A lot of the films that would be made about the Troubles and what happened, the conflict and what happened, are an absolute nonsense. They don't actually, and they're nearly always propaganda. So I think that's a, people are saying the thing and they think, oh, this is really what happened. Like, it's the same with any historical or any movie that's based on historical events. They take a lot of license with it. So I would say, first of all, don't take any of the the stuff that happens on the screen as being a reflection of what really happened. But there's I'm just sort of now trying to think what books. I mean, there was one book that comes to mind straight away, which was really interesting. It doesn't actually go into the history so much, but it was written by an IRA man who was in prison. So he did his PhD when he was in prison, and this book was published out of his thesis, really. And he wrote his thesis on Troubles literature from the very beginning of the Troubles right up to the end of the Troubles. So the Troubles is the euphemism for the conflict that happened in the North. So his contention was that, all the literature was being written by English people or British people, and they were getting those things printed and published because they were going to continue the propaganda about Irish people, about Ireland, about the IRA, about the conflict. And every IRA man was like a knuckle dragging, Neanderthal from a swamp. A savage, a kind of a brute who had no intelligence. And that was the way IRA men were portrayed in literature. And he analysed every single piece of literature written about the Troubles, showing that a lot of it was just propaganda. And then as sort of we came into the 90s, there were then Republicans writing these books, and they were able to uh, tell the story from the Republican side. So it was really important to start getting out that. So that his name was Patrick McGee. He was put in jail for trying to blow up the Tory Party conference. I think it was 1983. So yeah, he and others blew up the hotel that the Tories, the Conservative Party, was staying in for the conference, and Margaret Thatcher was the leader at the time, and she was very much defiant about that, but she nearly got killed in that bomb. So Patrick McGee, who wrote the book I was talking about there, he was one of the people caught for that, and he was serving a life sentence, but got out after the Good Friday Agreement, because that was part of the agreement that the prisoners should be released. So I think as well that there's actually a decent book that's written about the hunger strikes, which happened in the early 80s, 80, 81, where Republican prisoners in the H blocks went on hunger strike, and they actually started. Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister of Britain, and she just let them die. So they had to call off the strike after about 10 of them died, because there was just going to be a massive body count. There's a good book on the hunger strikes. It's called 10 Men Dead. So that's actually another good one. And that, ironically, is written by a British reporter, but he was reporting on everything that happened. But it's actually a good account of what happened, of the motivations of the hunger strikers. So the hunger strike was basically IRA prisoners who were in the H blocks. That was the name given to the prison where most of the Republicans were kept, and they were just being treated. They were downgraded from having political status as prisoners to having to being ordinary prisoners. So they were being criminalized, and that was kind of key. That was a key problem, because they weren't in prison because of anything criminal. They were in there for political reasons. And this was, again, the British government trying to do all the tactics they could to try and, I suppose, take down the Republican movement. This is part of their propaganda war. So the Republicans tried a number of different protests to be able to tried a number of protests to try and get political status back. And the last ditched attempt then was to go on hunger strike, which is actually a kind of a tradition in the Irish psyche to go on hunger strike. It's more a statement rather than I'm going to starve myself to death. It's more a statement of to try and show how opposed they are to a certain situation. So the British government just let them die. So in the end, there was like 10 prisoners who died before it was called off. So that book is quite good, 10 Men Dead. And is because it's written by an English reporter, it means it's not going to have all this Irish bias. So it's probably quite a decent one. I'm trying to think about then the best book to read about the Troubles, because again, it's trying to get somebody who is. I think there's one it's just called The IRA by Tim Pat Coogan. I think that one is always put up there as being a pretty good overview of the IRA and the Irish situation. And I'm racking my brains here.
No,
Maybe,
that's okay. You don't have to go.
yeah.
I don't mean to quiz you on all the literature of
I'm
the
just trying to. I'm just trying to think because I've read quite a lot, but then it's just I should have maybe thought that would have been a very useful thing to do. Maybe the armed struggle, the history of the IRA is the English Richard English, um, and he is English, but that's his surname as well. He wrote that, the history of the IRA, so that's actually quite a good one too. And then there's been um, certain books written by Irish Republicans like Lawrence McKeown, who was one of the men on hunger strike, and who obviously didn't die on hunger strike. Um, so anything written by him, and there's God, I forget the guy's. This is terrible. They could read anything by Jerry Adams as well, who well, the earlier stuff where he's actually talking about something historical, not his later stuff, which is a lot of what he does um, where he's talking about it, his antics and social media and stuff. It's a bit bizarre, but his earlier stuff would be quite decent to read. Yeah, so sorry if that's kind of was a bit rambling there. And
No. It's okay. It's okay. I was wondering how this, because you're talking about how before you had mentioned that the conflict in some ways had been sort of talked about through the scope of like religion, but then you have all of this history of colonization and imperialism. So you have like these multiple layers that people are viewing this through, both English and Irish people. And I'm wondering sort of how that plays out today. Like, how does this shape not only the politics, but the social atmosphere, the economics of Ireland today? And also, the thing that I'm thinking about here is, you had mentioned that there's sort of a new, that there's new troubles today. And like the troubles today are not the troubles of the past, that some of that lingers, of course, those legacies sometimes we can never get rid of, it seems like. But at the same time, in this new neoliberal context, like you have a different view of what the primary antagonisms are in society today. How much of that is shared by your peers in the country, people you're working with, and how much of this past sort of still shapes and shades the way that people are viewing current, economic downturns, whatever it may be?
Yeah, it's really interesting because that's a good question. I think there's a couple of different parts that I can answer that question. In the South, which is the Republic, the part of Ireland that got independence. When it got independence, it went merrily on its way, and it was the promise was always supposed to be that it would try to get independence for the 6 counties that were left under British rule, but that kind of never happened. They just got caught up in getting on with building the state and setting all the departments up and the government up and getting everything up and running. And the partition was a physical boundary, but it also became a psychological boundary. So we talk about each other in terms of somebody from the north, somebody from the south, northern politics, southern politics. They're 2 separate jurisdictions now, and there's actually Irish people who talk about the north like it's part of Britain. You just have rows of people saying, "I'm not actually in the UK. I'm in Ireland." No, you're in the UK, and this is your own Irish people. So that's the legacy of partition, that mindset. And also in the north, the northerners, a lot of northerners would feel that they were left behind and they were sort of just thrown to the wolves by the south. So it's created a lot of division in the country. I think in the north, it really the national question, the issue of partition, the border, and British rule really dominates the politics. Plus, the north was the place that had the conflict, so you have a real legacy from that. You have a lot of people who were involved in that conflict who were killed, their loved ones, how do they feel now? That's very much a present thing for them. And also, um, you know, people who were actually part of the conflict and have come out of it now. Some of them are involved in politics, but the politics is very much shaped by the national question, and it's very much ingrained in the past. That's what happens up here. That's one thing. In the South, because they just went along and kind of forgot about it, and then it was like every time there was a bomb or a shooting, it would be like, they're not still fighting up there, are they? What are they doing? That kind of attitude. So they were all very glad to see the conflict end, but it didn't really bring the two jurisdictions closer together. And in the South, what you've got is a place that doesn't really, that remembers its past, I think up to 1916 or up maybe to 1921 when partition happened. They sort of don't really care about what happened after that in the North. For them, Irish history, we got everything sorted. We got independence in 1921. And they like looking back at that time, but they don't like thinking about the modern conflict. And they actually, a lot of the time, would be on the side of the British and think, the poor British were being victimised there, and bombs were happening in London, and that wasn't right. They don't kind of think, well, the poor Catholics in the North, what was happening to them, But so that kind of division has happened. But I would say politically, outside of the national question, Ireland is conservative, North and South, very, very conservative. In the North, you had the Protestant class ruling, so that's like 18th century mentality about rights, about any kind of liberal movement forward. In the South, you had the Catholic Church running the place, and they were worse than the British nearly. They really persecuted people, and some awful atrocities. There's horrible abuses of children, women, really awful things that are kind of coming out now, and people are really angry about now. But it means that the country is very conservative. So although we were maybe on one hand rebellious against this foreign force, we weren't like the South Americans who are really socialist and really militant that way. I love their attitude, but we're not like that. So what Ireland has tended to do, North and South, both because of the influence from Britain and then the Southern Irish connection with the US, what you get is just a complete embracing of neoliberalism. So the politics is neoliberal, really, and there's nobody that's saying, there's very few voices that are saying we need to change that system. And I see that as the problem now. I said earlier, there's no point in having a 32 county Ireland all ruled by Irish people. That's not actually going to be that good if we're all in a neoliberal system. So to me, the focus has to change, but there's very few people in that place, very few. And I worked in mainstream politics. I thought I worked for Sinn Féin, who would be the party of Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness, and seen as the Republican Party here. And I think they are very much, a lot of people, individuals within that, are trying to do something different. And I think overall the party wants to do something different, but I think they're resigned, like a lot of left parties are resigned to the fact that, we can't do anything about neoliberalism. It's here. This is what we've got. And so the best we can do is just try to tweak the system a bit to make it less painful for some people. But we can't risk, doing all these really loony left things like massive taxes for corporations, or a universal basic income or whatever it is, you can't risk doing that because the whole thing will just collapse and people will be worse off. So there's that fear that everybody is gripped on about trying to overturn neoliberalism. And I think when I was working for them and worked for them for almost a decade, and I did, I was very proud to work for them. I really believed in what they did. But then I think I became very disillusioned as time went on, not so much with them, but the system that they were having to operate within. And, Stormont, which is the seat of government for the North, we're talking about a tiny place. It's a glorified council, but, local authority, but that is a neoliberal institution, following neoliberal policies, with a whole pile of sectarianism and, um, conservatism thrown in so that you don't have, you can't have abortion, you can't have same-sex marriage, all those kind of things that even people in the Middle East, the like even most countries now are sort of trying to move out. Oh, the South is even moving out of that, but those laws are still here. So that is the problem with the mainstream politics here. That they are in this neoliberal system. They don't believe the. A lot of them are very happy to be in it. Actually, the majority of political parties here are very happy to be in that neoliberal system and support it 100%. And the ones that aren't happy within it, like Sinn Féin or People Before Profit or the Green Party, sort of the Labour Party, those kind of elements, they just don't know how to overturn it, and they're resigned to it. So that's where things are stuck. And then every so often there's going to be mayhem over some historical thing then that rakes up all this, the historical stuff and the conflict, and then there's a war of words over that, and then that dies down, and then it's just back to business again with neoliberalism. So it's kind of a depressing, bleak picture, really. And I think that is why I got really disillusioned with mainstream politics, and realized that the system, you can't take down neoliberalism from within neoliberalism. I think you can't do that within any system. You have to go outside the system and try to chip away at it from there, which is where I'm at now, which is like, I just believe that it's about your own personal activism, getting involved in grassroots activism, and activism from the bottom up as opposed to the top down. So I don't know if that answered your question. Or?
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. What's the economic difference between the South and northern or the north of Ireland, as you said? I mean, so in other words, because the South was able to gain independence, I mean, is there a massive level of like unequal development? So where you would have maybe more poverty in the north, you would have less social services. Is that the case, or is that?
It's funny. You would think that it would have gone like that, but I suppose the only good thing, and I really want to be careful about, what did the Romans ever do for us? I don't want to be going down that road, but because the British have a national health service, which I think is a brilliant idea. Every country should have that. It means that the North has the National Health Service, has the NHS.
Okay.
So health-wise, we get free health. Free up here, we get free. We have medical cards. Everybody gets, free to go and see your doctor, go to hospital, any kind of treatment. All our prescriptions are free. In the South, because like the state, think about some of those African countries that got independence, and then the corrupt people that sadly crept into positions of power probably helped get put there by the previous colonizer. But those countries have been strangled by those kind of corrupt leaderships, and then all the other things that the Western countries are doing to them to continue sort of colonialism by the back door. But that's kind of Ireland's a bit like that. It it never wasn't quite being ruled by proxy by the British, but the Irish people who came into power were extremely conservative, pro-Catholic, um, and so they ruled with a really kind of draconian and narrow-minded view. And they didn't even, the idea of a national health service, they were completely opposed to something like that, because it was the church that was running a lot of the hospitals, and they were getting a lot of money from the state for that. So they didn't want a national health service because they were getting money for this. Right. And then there was, so something like that, even in health, the South didn't quite, the South couldn't do what was happening in the North. Then the British, because everything was getting blown up here, the British were having to rebuild things. So a lot of the infrastructure in the North as well was new.
See, that's what we got to do to get new infrastructure in the U.S. Anybody who's listening, start blowing shit up. I'm joking. But yeah, we'll get some new bridges.
Just to be clear that, it's not the best way to do it, no. Obviously, but it was one of those kind of side effects of everything getting blown up. So you were getting the news of the new belt, right. And then the South was a bit of a banana republic. It just didn't have a lot of money, and it had a lot of shysters who were getting into power and who were seeing how they could benefit from it. It was kind of sad, really, the way things ended up. So the South didn't end up being that good. Of course, then the South had this thing called the Celtic Tiger, which is like the worst thing that happened to any country in the world. I mean, it's just absolutely appalling. And that was all based on becoming a tax haven, and nobody is allowed to say that in the South. I would probably be lynched if I said that openly, because they're very proud of the Celtic Tiger, and they're trying to chase that, and they're trying to say we can get that back. And I mean, it was basically about being a tax haven, right. And so Ireland sort of prostituted itself to, for the personal gain of some individuals, really is what happened there. And tiny gains for the country, but when, tax havens don't help the country that hosts the tax haven, but they destroy the economies of other countries too, because everybody's been robbed of their taxes. Right. So that's where the South went, and hugely corrupt as regards the political people involved in that. Massive corruption, like on a scale it hasn't even been properly written about yet or exposed, because Irish people have this loyalty to their political leaders and vote for them even when they're scumbags. I'm not going to have anybody tell me he's a scumbag. I'm going to vote for him anyway. Or my family has voted for that party for generations. I have to vote for him. So it's all this kind of thing. Right. It's ridiculous. But that's kind of what happened to the economy down south. It has never properly recovered from that, the crash in 2008. It destroyed the place. And of course, as usual, people hit hardest were the poorest people, the most vulnerable, children, families, and there was loads of people losing their jobs, but also losing their homes. Just couldn't afford to pay for them, so there was just devastation down there. the North, because it was part of the economy of Britain. It it weathered the storm a bit better. Plus, it never had the high. Although it was a fake high, it never had the high of the Celtic Tiger the way the South did. So it didn't have as far to fall. 2008, but the North is economically. I mean, here in the North, the most jobs are public sector jobs. The private sector isn't that healthy. They struggle. There's a lot of unemployment. There's a lot of economic inactivity too, which is a horrible name, but it's a horrible term, but it's used to talk about people who can't work because maybe they've got health problems, mental health problems. And there's a lot of that too because of the conflict and
Sure.
People kind of traumatized after that. And there's skills deficits, and there's all sorts of problems with the northern economy. For a while, it was actually a real powerhouse. It was a massive shipbuilder. Everybody knows about the Titanic. Yeah, it was built in Belfast.
I didn't know that.
If I was them, oh, you did.
Shit, no.
If I was them, I wouldn't tell anybody. But they've actually got a Titanic Quarter. I mean, queue here for the Titanic. Really, I mean, that's how kind of lacking in imagination they are. They built the Titanic there. But it was really well known for shipbuilding. And then during the Second World War, the British obviously got lots of their ships built there. And also there was a massive linen industry here before cotton became the political material of choice and wiped out everything else. But there was a lot of big industries in the north. And that was kind of partly why partition thing also happened, because the Protestant population in the north did not want to let go of that or let the southerners get their hands on their big northern industries. So in the early 20th century, maybe even up to nearly the mid 20th century, the economic situation for Protestants anyway was really good for in the north. And there was a lot of industrial work going on and plenty of jobs that way. And then because that was connected to the British economy, it meant that they weren't just a small place trying to export to. They were part of a British economy exporting to the world. So they didn't want to let that go. And you can see it. That's really economic reasons for that, as opposed to even political reasons for having partition. But those industries, like most industries in the West, and as globalization creeps in and neoliberalism takes hold, those industries just died out. There's still shipbuilding. I don't think they even build ships anymore, but there's still the place, the Harland and Wolff site. They still have some industries in Belfast, but it was hugely diminished. So that's kind of where, that's the economic landscape. So some things, mostly actually, it's really horrible to say this, but mostly you're kind of better off if you're living in the north.
Really?
That's just, I hate saying that, but the South made such a horlicks of it.
Right.
They really did make such a horlicks of the state. And they didn't go down the socialist route, which was really what the 1916 Rising was about. It was about trying to get a socialist Ireland. But they just couldn't get them to do that. And it went down this very conservative, oppressive route that wasn't very good economically. And then when the economic boom happened, it was because they had just become a tax haven. So it's kind of a bit tragic. The British might say, well, that's what happens when you try to rule yourselves because you're too stupid. But really, that's what happens when you've had, your resources taken out of your country and not been allowed to develop for 800 years.
Right.
You know,
Right.
that's what's going to happen. How would you have a clue to this is how you should run the place after that?
Right.
You know, and that's what happens in a lot of countries where these colonial powers pull out of, you know, they haven't been able to run their own countries, their own affairs in so long. They struggle to know how to do it.
Right.
You know,
all that wealth and all that knowledge has been either destroyed or stolen. No, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
You know what I'm thinking, because we haven't even gotten up to today, and I have all kinds of questions around Brexit, what people in Ireland are thinking about all these different right-wing governments around the world, Trump, Modi, Putin, Erdogan, Bolsonaro, that's sort of like all of this happening. The internal politics, what you've been doing after electoral politics, what the cultural situation is there. We haven't gotten to any of that stuff, and I don't want to take 2 or 3 hours today. So what do you think about, because that was like a really nice, I think, encapsulation of like the history, how you view it, the differences. Maybe we could do a second one that would go into like, what have you been doing after working with mainstream politics? Like what are the different initiatives, campaigns, projects that you're involved in? And then just your take on like currently what's happening. How has Ireland been dealing with the pandemic, economic downturn, climate change, all this other shit that I would like to talk to you about? Well, not shit, but you know.
Yeah, but no, that would be a good idea, because it's almost like the past and now is sort of taking it up to the present day and what's happening. Yeah. So no, that would be good. Yeah, definitely. Because there's still massive sort of issues there in the middle of all that, and Brexit being definitely one of them.
Yeah.
So yeah, I that was you made it really easy, I have to say. So I kind of felt I was getting into the flow of it, although kind of I'm stuttering and stammering a fair bit, but
no, you're fine.
But let's do part 2 then.
Yeah, well, you said it was a tragedy, so next time we'll make it a comedy. We'll have some drinks before we get on here. You're like, all right, now that everybody's thoroughly depressed as shit from that first part of the interview, we'll jump into the second part, which is a comedy on the tragedy. No, I think it was awesome. Yeah, I think it was good.
Thanks.
Serge is giving you the thumbs up.
I was like,
just the sound, though. He's not happy about the sound. He's like, no. Next time, he's like, no moving your hands around, no shuffling stuff on the desk.
I know. Sorry about that. It was okay. It was okay after that point, wasn't it?
Yeah. It was great. It was great.
Because I was just waving my hand over here, like in midair and stuff. So,
no, it was great after that.
Okay, happy days.
Sergio grew up in them Soviet schools in the Eastern Bloc. So if you tell him to sit still for 8 hours, that's exactly what he'll do.
Hey, I went to convent school, and I was supposed to be, the same thing happened to me, but I rebelled against it. So.
Yeah, so did he. He got in trouble too. His parents told me. All the rebels. You've been watching Park Media. I'm your host today, Vince Emanuele, and we'll talk to you soon. Hey, thank you for watching and listening. If you think this program is worth a pack of cigarettes or a cheeseburger, you could become a Patreon for as little as $3 a month. The link is available at our website, parkmedia.org. That's PARCmedia.org. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel below. Also, you could find us on Instagram at Park Media, Facebook at Politics, Art, Roots, Culture, and you could find me on Twitter at Vince Emanuele.